So I'm Amel Omari. I'm a doctoral candidate at the School of Public Health. These nameplate slides are each 20 seconds for our transition. Ooh, let's go. I want to start by sharing the experience of a pretty typical day during the first half of my doctoral program. I wake up and sleepily check the time on my phone. It's about 2 hours before my alarm is set to ring. I tell myself that I should really get some more sleep before my day begins, but I already know that's not going to happen. A knot has formed in my stomach that keeps me awake, and I stare at the ceiling as the sun begins to rise, running through my day's to-do list over and over in my mind. Finally, still long before my alarm rings, I give up on sleep and decide to flip on my laptop and start frantically working through the list. What has got me so panicked? Today, there may as well be a big red X on my calendar. It's a day I've dreaded, tried to prepare for, and in equal measure, tried not to think about for the past week. Is it the day of a serious surgery, a job interview, a career-changing presentation? No. This red X day is a meeting with my advisor. Not a special meeting either, just our regular monthly meeting. In the course of my first 2 years of the doctoral program, I found that regular meetings with professor-level advisors were deeply anxiety-provoking. I would spend hours before each meeting wondering if I had done enough since last time. Once the meeting began, I often actually avoided sharing my work in progress. Instead, I kind of tried to stall for time until I felt I had a really polished product to showcase. And judging from my anecdotal conversations, this is not my experience alone, but one that I share with many students of marginalized identities, especially at the beginning of the PhD. While I can't speak for other students' reasons for this anxiety, I reflected on my own. I felt a sense of urgency not to waste my professor's time. I think this came from imposter syndrome, assuming that only my very best, most finished work was worth an advisor's feedback. I worried that asking for help meant that I was not capable of producing ideas on my own. If I couldn't figure out how to develop my research completely alone, did I really belong here? As I entered my third year of the doctoral program, and yes, it did take that long, I began to realize that my habit of hiding my thinking until it was fully formed left a gap in my process. RacismLab helped fill that gap for me, and I'm going to tell you why. So at that time, I was wrestling with a lot of ideas, struggling in that mushy, soupy space where the literature just seems like a mass of disorganized ideas. My own conceptual vision of the connections between racism and health, a vision that might have helped me see the patterns in that massive literature, was not yet solidified. As I was searching for that solid ground, I kept thinking about this refrain that I had often heard. People talk too much about race. If we all saw people as just human and forgot about race, the world would be a better place. Despite hearing this a lot, I knew from my own family's history that this wasn't exactly an accurate take. See, my father's family are mostly immigrants to France from post-colonial Algeria, where race and ethnicity had been an organizing principle of the French colonial empire until Algeria's independence. But since the end of the Second World War, France has shifted gears and increasingly tried to enforce colorblindness by erasing the idea of race from the public space. It's illegal to ask about in surveys, and the word race was even struck from the French Constitution. Despite their efforts, racism and discrimination still impact my family's daily lives. While I might sometimes pass as white adjacent in Ann Arbor or Detroit, my cousins are instantly recognized as other in Paris or Lyon. How could I investigate the connection between their experience and health without access to race identifiers in surveys? I was struggling to think through this challenge, and I wasn't finding much guidance in the literature, since quantitative work on racism and health is so rare in the French space. I was starting to realize that finding my solid ground, developing my own organizing vision would benefit from feedback. My ideas would never reach their full potential if I didn't talk about what I was thinking at multiple points in the process. However, showing up to my professor's office to just talk without a plan felt unthinkable to me. Around this time, a few of my friends suggested that I check out RacismLab's first ever event, featuring Philomena Essid, who conducted qualitative work on everyday racism and that compared women's experiences across national contexts. Her presence at the event helped me realize there was a space on campus where others were working on a similar range of ideas as me. So I decided to take a risk and try to present my truly work-in-progress ideas at RacismLab. Though my first presentation was a clumsy attempt to apply my thoughts to improving quantitative approaches to the study of racism and health in France, I got encouragement that what I was thinking could be done and could be a real contribution. The group riffed off my presentation and one another, building a sense for the potential of this research path. This positive experience of synergistic thinking, excitement, and investment in my work helped me reframe the study of racism in France not as an impossibility, but as an opportunity. Whereas in US research, we can pop a race variable into our models without a second thought, I had the opportunity to ask what race meant underneath that familiar list of checkboxes, which are really a crude proxy of race's actual meaning in the social world. I found that racism was not a place to develop my ability to manage a competitive or prickly audience. That is an important skill, but just as importantly, this was a place where people who had the background, interest, and commitment to try to understand what I was trying to develop spent the time to help me get to where I was trying to go. Because everyone in RacismLab was working to develop ideas that they couldn't find in the literature, they helped me articulate the reasons to pursue a non-mainstream idea. The practice that I got showcasing my ideas during their formative stage was in itself a skill that I could bring back to my advisors' offices. I'm now far better at taking advantage of my advisors' expertise rather than focusing on just trying to survive the meeting. Now, nearing the end of my doctoral education, those anxious days where I wake up before my alarm still do sometimes happen. However, I've reached a point where I'm eager to share new ideas and excited to take advantage of feedback. RacismLab helped me learn how much farther that can take me. Thank you.
I am Channing. Just stand here until it starts. Okay. Picture it, summer 2013. I was prepping for my third and final year as a high school teacher in the Democratic Republic of Congo while simultaneously applying for graduate school. And I'll spare you all the ugly cries and giving ups that happened during that process and fast forward to the good part. I was accepted to the University of Michigan. And while I was excited and albeit a little surprised about my acceptance to such a prestigious university, I had one really strong worry. How will I directly connect with and serve Black and Brown communities if I become a researcher in the ivory tower? In other words, how will I live the work that I study? My entire graduate career has been driven by this question. I think of my scholarly journey as a seesaw. Being a great graduate student has often been a counterbalance to being an advocate for the communities that I care about. As a result, I'm constantly wrestling to find my balance between my research and my advocacy. My first year focused on the research side of the seesaw. I threw myself into learning how to be a graduate student, learning the ins and outs of stats, attending lab meetings, and presenting in conference symposia. And as a member of the Achievement in Context Lab, I dove headfirst into learning about how Black youth understood what it meant to be Black and how those understandings related to their academic achievement. As a member in the Advancing Critical Consciousness Methods and Equity Lab, I thought deeply about how Black and Brown youth understood their race in connection with racial inequality. I wondered how these youth's recognition of inequality could be an asset to their development, to help them prepare for the potential prejudice and discrimination they were likely going to face. And while I was learning a lot through that discussion, I was feeling disconnected from the people who mattered most to me, Black and Brown students. I started to look toward the other side of the seesaw, noticing that I was off balance. So I threw myself into the other side, into the community that felt closest to me, that of my fellow graduate students of color. As president of Students of Color at Rackham, I served as an advocate for graduate students of color to be more visible and included in the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Plan, which was due to roll out in the fall of 2015. And with an amazing executive board, I led over 15 events for graduate students of color, engaging issues around race, social justice activism, self-care, and portrayals of Black people and people of color in the media. Such events emerged from listening to the needs of graduate students and from my vision to create the graduate experience that fully engaged my deepest passions. And while I worked diligently to build this community, I was having a hard time finding a little balance between my research and my leadership. I began to feel a little pulled too thin and was feeling the pressure from my advisors to perform, produce, and step away from the leadership that meant so much to me. So I seesawed right back into my research. I worked on strengthening my methodological skills through psychometric projects focused on developing rigorous measures of ethnic racial identity. I worked on a qualitative project interviewing Black college students about their successes and challenges in life at college. And I empirically examined variation in civic engagement in Black and Latinx students. But I couldn't quite fully step into my research hat. I still needed to connect with students. I became an instructor for Wolverine Pathways, a college readiness program designed for Black and brown faces to learn about the critical thinking they needed to get to college. My 7th grade students brought me inexplicable joy, and they gave me meaning to the statistical analyses I was running every day. But even still, in these spaces that felt truly enriching for my work, I still struggled with how to integrate my research with my connection to the community. Despite my dedication to supporting the strengths and success of Black and brown children, I really struggled with this balance. Enter RacismLab alumna and co-founder, Dr. Courtney McClooney. Since my first year as a graduate student, Courtney has brought me under her wing, pushing me to see the leadership skills that I didn't think I possessed. You see, she is the reason why I became the SCORE president, and she's also the reason why I entered RacismLab in 2017. That was the year we brought in the award-winning poet, Claudia Rankine. She discussed her widely acclaimed book, Citizen, which analyzes race and racism through lived experiences, prominent symbols and events, and everyday occurrences that unveil the invisibility of structural racism rooted in American society. And in listening and learning from Claudia Rankine, I was enthralled. She was doing what I wanted to do, bridging research with her lived experiences. She used her artistry to teach the subtleties of racism and how it created connections that both link and separate us in American society. I saw Claudia Rankine as someone pushing through her boundaries and forging her own path for herself. And when I looked inward, I began to see myself in the same light, someone who had been trying throughout my graduate career to create a multifaceted path for myself. I was now ready to forge my own path into becoming a professional who is a teacher, a scholar, an activist, and a leader. So with this example in mind, I went back to my desk and sat with the question, how do I live the work that I study? Thinking about my experiences as a teacher, a Black woman, a scholar, and an activist, I put in work to advance a model in which I fold the seesaw up to hold both research and community in the same space. And through several collaborative discussions and presentations of my in-progress work with my RacismLab colleagues, I developed an integrative model that describes the overlap between ethnic racial identity and critical consciousness processes in youth of color. This model resulted in my first author publication, of which the first draft emerged from our annual RacismLab writing retreat. And it was in RacismLab that I was able to marry my interests between race, identity, and the dismantling of social inequality. So ultimately, my response to the question, how do I live the work that I study, has come from my participation in RacismLab. As a member, I was exposed to new ideas and people who provided stepping stones to produce knowledge of my own. And now as a co-coordinator, I support a pipeline of scholars of color to pursue the interdisciplinary study of structural racism. And in doing so, I am a scholar activist.
Dr. Courtney McClooney, I was one of the founders of RacismLab. I'm currently a postdoc and an incoming professor at Cornell University's ILR School. So I started on this journey by first telling my parents that I am proud to switch my major from pre-med to psychology. And their response was, what are you going to do with that degree? As a first generation college student, I honestly did not have a clear idea. All I knew was that the study of the human experience, in particular Black experiences, was something that was resonating with me strongly. At the same time, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill had recently started a McNair Scholars Program, and this was designed to increase the number of ethnic minority, low-income, first-generation students in pursuing doctorate degrees. So I thought, here's an opportunity to get paid, to learn more about psychology, and to pursue this thing called research, even though at the time I had no idea what that was. Then entered Drs. Enrique Neblett and Tiffany Griffin, both alum of the University of Michigan Psychology Department and people who were at UNC explicitly studying the effects of racism on the health and well-being and economic progress of Black Americans. So they became my mentors to the McNair Scholar Program, encouraged me to study racism in any context that I was interested in. And that happens to be the workplace. I had witnessed personally from my father advancing in his organization, becoming the first Black manager in his North Carolina-based manufacturing plant, and also seeing just across the news and my own experiences that the workplace is a space where racism is reproduced, reinforced, created, and legitimized. So I completed this McNair Scholars Program. I was not that happy when I completed it, but I felt that I was so happy. And I was proud to apply to graduate school and welcome everyone into the study of racism in the workplace. I thought it's going to be widely accepted. We all agree that it's a problem and we should eradicate it, right? That was my hope, dream, naive thoughts. But I quickly faced lots of rejections. Not only rejections of research papers, which is common in our field, it helps make the scholarship better, but also just overall rejection of the idea that racism is a thing, that it's a problem, that it's something we should be talking about in organizational behavior context. What about white women and sexism? Isn't that just as important? Why can't we create this hierarchy? So the more I tried to center Black people and race in my scholarship, the more feedback I was getting that I should switch my focus to something more palatable, use words like diversity and inclusion, people that's hot right now, that's sexy. But when you say race, everyone just kind of cringes. No, don't talk about this, right? It's like it's too much for people to handle. And my colleague, Veronica Rebello, and I received a very crushing blow from a feminist psychologist that is well known in the field and highly admire. When she was a special issue editor for a journal on women's leadership, we submitted a paper focusing on Black women. And she said, we already have one paper on race. You don't need it. So that experience helped me to now understand this concept that I've been studying in my work that I title marginalization. And these are practices that are part of institutions that become legitimized because they reinforce the values of that institution. But at the same time, they perpetually keep certain groups, ideas, perspectives at the margin of those institutions. So I've studied this work through my research with Black employees, some of their code switching behaviors to survive and navigate these institutions. But it's really hard to point out these invisible norms and biases that we have in place. That mainstream safe topics in our field are what gets published, and all the other topics become relegated to special issue journals or to journals that don't count towards tenure. And being able to name this framework helps me understand that I didn't want to force myself into this small, narrow space that they've created for me in my scholarship in the academy. Instead, what was going to happen to me if all these pieces I left behind of myself were left out of this identity that I really loved from a young age? I always wanted to be the scholar, and I didn't know how I could do it if I couldn't fit into the mold. So I was feeling a bit demoralized in graduate school when I saw this flyer to participate in a study. And it was asking for Black women to come into a lab. We're going to expose you to a stressful experience and have to do with the workplace. I said, oh, that's me. That's what I want to do. Who is running this study? And how have I never ran into them before? And that is when I met the incomparable Dr. Margaret Hicken, and here comes the tears. Because I was so over grad school when I met Maggie, and she encouraged me to continue pursuing this work because racism is important. And it didn't matter that I was living the scholarship. It was more important to pursue it because people like her existed. We were able to create RacismLab. So we first got resources from Rackham to create an interdisciplinary working group. And then ISR came along and also provided resources. And it's because of RacismLab I'm here today, and I was able to pursue this work. So in our first few years, we had a writing group. We put on workshops and conferences like these, and one of our crowning achievements was the Social Science and Medicine special issue, where I also got my first author publication, focusing on racism in the workplace. And Maggie helped to bring this together. We had over 200 submissions And the editor said, we don't know if you'll have enough to fill up a journal. And I was like, but we do. And my parents were able to celebrate that achievement with me and all the achievements that came after that. So this was at the Boucher Honor Society induction. And to be a first generation college student that can study race and have my parents celebrate that with me has been an honor. I'm sorry that I'm crying. I told my kids to cry. It also became very relevant for my professional career because my first placement outside of grad school was at the University of Virginia. And that first month, white supremacists marched through our campus and said, you will not replace us. So then this focus on racism became important. It was no longer invisible to people who hadn't seen it before. And they said, okay, you're the expert on this, tell us what to do. So I have continued to publish scholarship, both in professional, peer-reviewed academic journals, but also mainstream outlets like Harvard Business Review, MIT Sloan Management Review, a full book volume that focuses on Black experiences in the workplace. I never would have thought this would have been possible for us if it hadn't been for spaces like RacismLab that encouraged me to do it. And then my job interview for the ILR school, one of the things that the dean said he loved about my work, he said, you didn't shy away from those tough conversations about race. We care about justice and equity here, and what you're doing is what's needed in all universities. So we want you here to train scholars and to move this work out of the margins more towards the center, because this work is important and it needs to happen. So I'm gonna stop now before I keep crying, but thank you so much for having me.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Aresha. I'm an instructor at the University of Chicago. It's such a pleasure to be here today. And it's going to be a hard one to follow, but I'll certainly try. So 3 years ago, when I first joined RacismLab, we brought Claudia Rankin to campus and organized a session on American racism here at ISR. I recall tweeting that morning, in a place where diversity is relegated to a book kiosk by the mailroom, this talk today at U of M ISR is powerful. Up until that point in my graduate training, time and time again, I was sent the message that issues of race and racism, immigration, gender and sexuality were soft science, me-search, a diversity supplement, that these issues did not answer big, essential questions in our fields. But I too had entered the academy as a McNair Scholar, a program specifically designed to prepare first-gen and underrepresented minority students to pursue graduate school. I had gotten the GRE prep, the research experience, several admissions offers. I benefited from a diversity program, but why did this place still feel like it was not for me? Most surprising, this was happening at a place like ISR and the University of Michigan, a program that I had specifically chosen because it has a rich history of training scholars of color. But I soon learned that, like in so many other institutions, inequities are built into the blueprint of this space. But it was our turn to rewrite that blueprint. With a little help from my friends, RacismLab helped me rewrite my blueprint. It shifted my experience in my doctoral program, helping me to refocus my research, but also providing me with important lessons that I bring with me now that I've entered a faculty position. I'd like to share some of those insights with you today. So first, at RacismLab, our experience centers race and racism. Indeed, it's in our name. Starting from a point of shared understanding that our science is hard science, valued science, removes much of the psychic labor that scholars of race experience. At the same time, it allowed us to ask hard questions and make mistakes to improve our work. Because racism is complex, as a group, we forwarded our interdisciplinary perspectives to try to create a new understanding of how race works, how it applies to our scholarship, and how to break down the silos of our fields. In many ways, I think this is what makes our work and scholarship strong and innovative to the field. In my own work, I push up against the often cited Hispanic paradox, a research finding that suggests that the health of Latinx communities declines with more time and across generations in the US. In much of the scholarship, individual health behaviors like diet, exercise, and culture are thought to drive these declines in health. Instead, my work draws on history, sociology, and anthropology to illuminate the ways in which Latinos have been racialized and marginalized in the US, and the gymnastics that American racism engages in across time to reproduce these inequities, even as socio-political circumstances and Latinx groups may change. Drawing on this foundation, my work then links these processes to health, reconsidering the ways in which Latinos' experiences of migration, state-sanctioned incarceration and detainment, and other forms of inequality become deeply embedded into one's skin and biology, reproducing health inequities. As demonstrated by the accomplishments of all of my fellow panelists and some of the work that the support I've received in my own work, the first lesson that we take away is that this approach to building scientific communities works. In the face of adversity, we built a space for our science to flourish, drawing on our strengths and removing the walls that isolated us previously. As a result, another lesson I've learned is to better decipher the language around diversity, equity, and inclusion. When we started RacismLab, U of M was rolling out a top-down DE&I initiative, while we were off creating our own grassroots coalition of scholars of color, working to transform the academy on our own terms. And we did this because we knew that nobody was coming to save us, and that we would rarely, if ever, be given the power to make institutional decisions that affected us and our success. Instead, we developed a group based on our own needs and goals, and mobilized enough resources to set up shop and establish our own blueprint. Now that so many of RacismLab members have gone on to successful and productive careers, many of us are poised to take on leadership roles, mentor students, and guide our respective fields to more interdisciplinary and revolutionary places of higher education, building equity into diversity and inclusion initiatives. So I now have moved on to another academic home. Like U of M and so many other higher education institutions around the country, we too are grappling with issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, at times succeeding in the areas of diversity, but falling woefully behind when it comes to actually matching these efforts with equity and inclusion. So as you can imagine, one of the first things I did when I landed on a new campus was I found my people. I brought together folks from across departments whose work centers race and racism, so I could create, in a new small way, my own version of RacismLab. And I now look out for students who also continue to feel left out of these academic spaces. My experiences at RacismLab continue to be transformative. So last fall, when I started my faculty position, I was asked by one of the senior members of the university, we've struggled with recruiting and retaining faculty of color. How do we get them to stay? For a moment, I hesitated. What did I know? I had just finished my dissertation. I had just scraped my way into a faculty position. I thought for a moment and I answered, it's not enough to hire us. You have to create a culture where we and our work are valued. We have to bring our full selves to work, and that's not quite happening yet. I looked around the table to see my peers, young faculty, mostly women of color, nodding their head in agreement. I'm not sure if he heard what I had to say, but they did. I learned about that last bit, bringing my full self to work, from my fellow RacismLab member, Courtney McClooney, and I had the backbone to share my truth to this person, an administrator who could eventually deny me tenure because of the lessons I learned from being in this space. RacismLab paved the way for me to become a stronger scholar, but more importantly, it sent me a new message about my voice in the academy and my place here. I mattered, and my work mattered. We are more than a stack of books in a diversity kiosk by the mailroom. Thank you.
The tissue so I don't get tempted. Dr. Jennifer Gomez, I'm tenure track faculty at Wayne State University, and then I earned my PhD in 2017. In trauma psychology, it is often one voice and one perspective that gets heard. And it's an important one from which we've been able to understand much about the abuse that children, teens, young adults, middle-aged adults, and elders endure. And it's this one perspective that has become the face of trauma psychology. So then what happens if you're you, if you're me, if you're anyone who's not this cis, white, relatively well-off, straight, typically abled woman? What happens if you're me and you look out into the field and see a void of erasure? How do you make a place for yourself then in the field? Well, if you're me, then you know that there's many scholars doing research and therapy in and with the rest of us. People like Drs. Tima Bryant-Davis, Laura Brown, Tricia Bent-Goodley, Namdi Pohl, Nicole Buchanan, Margaret Beale Spencer, Dr. Michael D'Ariano, and many others. If you're me, you also are looking outside of psychology to women of color feminisms, people like Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Gloria Anzaldúa, Julia Moraga, Tarana Burke, Linda Sarsour, and many others. And with this knowledge of these incredible scholars in psychology and outside, I know that I'm actually not that unique. And yet somehow I manage to often feel alone. Alone as I attend conferences, oftentimes is the only one. Alone is when I read our mainstream trauma journals that often privilege a different kind of work, a decontextualized view of trauma and its impact. So about 8 years ago, I began developing cultural betrayal trauma theory with this kind of classic Bronfenbrenner model of how the macro system, the dominant culture of bigotry, interfaces with marginalized people who at times are perpetrators of violence, at times are victims of violence, and how that with in-group violence has a unique and extra impact when somebody is victimized. So the idea here, if we look down at C, is that because of this mean red arrow of societal and structural and cultural inequality, some marginalized people, let's take Black people in the US, develop this bond with each other, what I call intercultural trust, kind of this racial solidarity and community, to buffer against that mean red arrow, to find a place for themselves. Now, this intercultural trust is really positive. It creates this bond and identity and community. The problem is, it also comes with this vulnerability that when within group violence happens here, Black perpetrator, Black victim, it violates this intercultural trust. And so then it's this cultural betrayal. And so this within group violence is then cultural betrayal traumas. And I propose that these cultural betrayal traumas, this within group violence, is going to be linked with things that we typically study with violence and abuse, things like suicide, as well as things that we typically don't, things like internalized prejudice. So it took a full 8 years before we can get the first theoretical paper published on cultural betrayal trauma theory. This hot off the presses in 2020. Black women and girls, thank you very much. 8 years is a long time, and me too. Rape, cultural betrayal, and healing. Just published, it's already been circulated in Time's Up, which is the nonprofit working to eradicate sexual violence. Now, with the success of this publication has come many rejections. I've had about 30 rejections over the years from these and other journals, and the rejections keep on coming. And you'll see these are a range of journals, including minority journals. Importantly, all the manuscripts that have been submitted and rejected here have since been published elsewhere. I, in fact, have over 50 publications published in peer-reviewed journals, chapters in books, articles in scholarly newsletters, and pieces for the general public. Pieces that translate this scholarship for everybody who doesn't actually live within the ivory tower, and who this work is actually for and with. So with this isolation, discrimination, success, rejection, what does an interdisciplinary racism lab do for me? Well, it provides this intellectually enriching space where I'm able to do and grow this work. It also provides validation that, yes, there is racism, number one. Yes, in academia too. Yes, in our fields too. And it gave me a space where I could work on the research that I'm doing without having to find different ways to say that Black people are human, that cultural and structural racism does in fact matter, that it does in fact, as it turns out, impact people, including their experience of violence and trauma, and their outcomes of violence of trauma, and whether they will disclose or not. And yes, Black people are worth us investigating how. Instead, with Racism Lab, I'm able to have a space where I can actually focus on the research. So my conceptualization, my research questions, my methodology, my data analysis, my writing are all better because I'm not having to be battling what can be just intractable bigotry. So without Racism Lab, I likely would contemplate leaving the field in academia much more often. I would be drowning underneath the inevitable structural and interpersonal discrimination I experience. And I would regret ignorantly choosing a field like psychology that is supposed to help humanity and manages to be oppressive in many ways, very often. With Racism Lab, I also know that I'm able to belong, even in elite spaces like this at the National Academy of Sciences Kavli Symposium, where junior scholars and attendees like myself are hand-chosen by members of the National Academy of Sciences as people who have already made contributions to the field and are poised to be leaders in science. And with Racism Lab, I don't just take, I'm also able to give back and to give intellectual contributions to my colleagues in this space. I also serve as a role model for the postdocs and students coming up behind me, that yes, this work is important, and the work and themselves do belong here in academia. And when I feel down, Racism Lab reminds me to continue fostering my community of race scholars outside of us, with other Ford Fellows, with junior faculty of color, with senior faculty of color who apologize unduly that they weren't able to fix the field for junior people like me. Oh, this is my picture, Maggie. So in Racism Lab, I know and I'm very present to the fact that I am part of the pipeline to help us infiltrate our fields. And I know that I'm doing that not just for me, but for everyone coming up behind me. We share hope, and we work to make that hope a reality. Thank you.